Hmm.
And at the time, of course, everyone believed that you persisted in higher rates of interest, ostensibly to fight inflation. And this is what I explained to my teacher, back in high school. He gave us the definitions of inflation and deflation as respectively as increases or decreases in circulation per represented wealth. And then immediately just claimed that an increase in circulation or inflation caused price inflation, what I call price inflation.
Hmm.
He said it resulted in increasing prices. See, I distinguish, between the two because they're separate things, and this cause isn't a fact at all. It's merely a part of the deception that increasing circulation causes price inflation. So bankers purportedly serve us by maintaining elevated rates of interest, which prevent us from paying higher prices, but which actually cause industry to have to increase its prices all the more if industry is to sustain margins of solubility. But because that is denied the market can't afford the higher prices, so the industry is eventually extinguished. But it's the interest which multiplies the artificial indebtedness, which is actually causing the need to increase prices, which is denied by the cost of interest. So, in fact, all that they're doing when they maintain elevated rates of interest, and I'm explaining this to the Reagan administration, is that they transfer the costs of price inflation over to the ledger of the banks and unearned profit from us, as if that's to our betterment. So it's like, oh, you're not going to have to pay more for the electric plugs in your house, but you're going to have to pay a heck of a lot more for your house, much more than the increase in prices of your plugs, because we're transferring that cost over here in interest, you see.
Yeah, and I'm not a mathematician, and I'm sure not many of the
But that's
people.
basic second grade math. I mean,
Yeah, but even then, that's what I'm going to say is that when they started teaching me all this stuff in school, I didn't believe it either. When they
uh,
started teaching me that this is what causes price inflation, and I ended up being a civil engineering technologist, and I could do some programming as well, but it I could never connect the dots. They would, the circuit would never close,
uh-huh.
and it and but I'm not a mathematician, so I could never I mean, I couldn't clear it out in my own head. But here, Perfect Economy is doing it and explaining exactly it is closing the circuit now. And
Yeah,
so
well,
for
that
the
circuit was actually closing this one day in high school, about 2 weeks into this economics course, because, I'm a kid who's, proving, challenging theorems, right off the top of my head, one after the other. A plus student through high school in advanced mathematics. Never missed a problem on a test through my whole high school career, and I'm stuck as a sophomore off in a an economics course, and I mean this
Yeah.
is doo-doo brain stuff. This is all phony pretended knowledge, and it's offensive to me. And I had about enough about 2 weeks into the course. There's not a proof of a theorem. It's all, excuse my language, it's bullshit.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
all bullshit, and as you intuited and many other people intuit. But when this teacher explained the definitions of inflation and deflation, and then said that circulatory inflation caused price inflation, my hand went up in the air. I had enough. And I'm a polite kid. I'm not going to be abusive and denigrating or anything like that. And I said, my hand just shot in the air, and I was recognized immediately because in fact, after he gave the definitions of inflation and deflation, every time Mr. Otto would say those words, ever afterward, he would say, "And Mike, what does inflation say?" And I would say, What do inflation and deflation mean?" And I would say, "An increase or decrease in circulation per goods and services, Mr. Otto." Because I was somehow the only kid in the class that got it. Just a definition. But when he gave the definitions and said that circulatory inflation caused price inflation, my hand shut up in the air. Excuse me, this is a second grade math problem and you're pulling the wool over my eyes. This is bullshit. And I call bullshit here. My hand went up in the air and I was immediately recognized, and I said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Otto, but I cannot accept that could possibly be true." And he looked a little uneasy, and I said, first of all, you've taught us that all money comes into circulation subject as a debt to a debt subject to interest, and you've taught us that the debts are collateralized. He goes, that's correct. And I said, how then is it even possible to have inflation, circulatory inflation? And he stood there, and his jaw opened, and he stood there, and he thought, and he stood there, and he thought, and he turned red in the face and redder in the face. And finally he says, by God, I think you're right. And I said, secondly then, if we have this circulatory inflation, which seems it would be theoretically impossible even to suffer if debts are merely collateralized, and in fact, if we account for Ron Paul's claims of circulatory inflation, this all concurs. In fact, he just decries how much money is being introduced to circulation when, in fact, unless you're accounting for what we're paying out of circulation in the way of principal and interest on this monumental sum of debt that we have now, you're not establishing the fact that we have circulatory inflation at all. You have to subtract what's being subtracted from the circulation as well. It's utterly stupid to decry that we're suffering circulatory inflation and that's causing our prices when we're not, our problems, when we're not even suffering circulatory inflation, and you haven't done the math right. So I say to Mr. Otto, I said, furthermore, if we suffered this circulatory inflation, which is seemingly impossible to suffer if debts are collateralized, I said, furthermore, being as the debts are subject to interest, this would comprise an implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation by perpetually borrowing the interest and principal that we pay out of the circulation back into circulation, which would increase the sum of indebtedness by so much as periodic interest, therefore on an ever greater sum of debt, until at an ever escalating rate we would accumulate a terminal sum of debt which would occupy an entire circulation to servicing it, denying anything at all to sustaining industry. Moreover, all the while this was transpiring, ever more of the circulation, therefore, would be dedicated to servicing the artificial sum of debt, denying us the capacity to afford the higher prices which industry would have to charge if it was to maintain margins of solubility. So in fact then, rather than circulatory inflation even being possible, it's interest which is the cause and the only systemic cause of increasing prices, and interest too, nonetheless, all the while, is what denies industry the capacity or the markets the capacity to absorb those higher costs, because ever more of the circulation is being dedicated instead to servicing this ever escalating sum and eventual terminal sum of artificial indebtedness. I says, therefore, how is it even possible that circulatory inflation is the cause of price inflation? And he stood there just, jaw just dropped with deep respect. Because I presented the arguments conclusively. I didn't just throw out an idea there. This was something that was a complete thought. And he thought even longer and turned even more red in the face. And he said, "By God, I think you're right again."
Yeah.
And so. Yeah. At 16 years old, I realized that there's such a thing as a mathematically perfected economy, because, first of all, this industry isn't justified. It results in terminal dispossession and terminal failure, which is solved only by, an eradication of interest. So we have basically, what seem to be unlimited things which could go wrong in a system. And I knew two things off the top of my head from this moment of thought that I spewed out in these questions, rhetorical questions to this teacher. I knew two things: that we could solve inflation and deflation. Second grade math. If you define something as an increase or decrease in respect to another thing, the only way that you eradicate increases or decreases in this other thing in respect to the other thing is to maintain the first thing always to be equal with the other thing. And of course, in the case of inflation and deflation, then there's actually also only one way to accomplish that, and that is likewise to eradicate interest and to impose this obligatory schedule of payment to pay and retire principal at the rate of consumption of the related property. And after all, this is exactly what we all desire to do. Pay $100,000 for a $100,000 house.
That's right.
The bank doesn't have anything to do with this. So
yeah, and you've clarified a couple things that are really good to point out too. That I've been telling people it was fifth grade math, but you've correctly told us that it's actually second grade math.
It is second grade math.
And the other thing too is that when you speak of terminal failure, I think it's important to understand for everybody that this is not something where they're going to get away with it. This is when we talk terminal failure, we're talking the whole system. And being a parent,
and the fact that you've
a parent,
a state that is unrecoverable. That's what I mean by terminal.
Right. And being a parasitic system, it's terminal for the parasite as well.
Right. Yeah. So long as the host doesn't die, and the host says, you know what, this leech that attached itself to me has now grown to 350 feet in length, and it's 8 feet in diameter, all down that length.
Yeah.
And it's about time I detach it.
Yeah.
You know?
And if you don't, it's going to take you down too. And that's what the elite need to understand. Even this is the message we have isn't just for the people.
They know.
They need to, but there's some of them that, like even the politicians, the middlemen, they need to understand that there's no getting away from this. There's no, this might work. It's going to be catastrophic, and it's going to be catastrophic for everybody.
Right. I say they know, and by that I mean at least intuitively, even if on the most rudimentary level, because this is why this proposition of mathematically perfected economy is met by invasion, or only by evasion for
right.
so long. You know, the thing is here to realize is how do we know that we have one solution, and then the next thing we want to discuss is how do we get there? How do we get to solution from where we are right now? So we need to understand how mathematically perfected economy solves all the issues of this imposed so-called banking system. So the first issue is categoric fault, is what I call inflation, deflation, and what I call maldisposition.
Mm-hmm.
So I've already defined maldisposition as this dedication of ever more of a circulation to sustaining, to servicing this escalating sum of artificial debt. Why is it important to group maldisposition with inflation and deflation? Well, even though Ron Paul people, of course, they claim that, you know, inflation is destroying us. Well, how do we solve inflation should be the real issue, and the only way is mathematically perfected economy, which maintains this one-to-one-to-one relationship between circulation, remaining value of represented property, and remaining obligation to pay just that much for the remaining value of the represented property. Both the creditor who has the money and the debtor who has to pay it out of circulation are therefore interested in maintaining this free market means of determining that, oh, my work is worth so much. And so we all have an interest, and we are the enforcers and policers of the fact that the value of the money stays the same. But when I went home from this day of school, you know, I knew that I had an important idea, although I didn't really estimate, you know, that it would become my life's work, and you know, and in fact, you know, I've been retarded as a mathematician by, you know, for 43 years I've been, you know, explaining mathematically perfected economy over and over and over again, and validating every contending proposition by the facts that were originally implied of my original proof of singular solution. And so we need to understand this proof of singular solution because it's second grade math. What was the difficulty is realizing that what I give to be the first categoric fault and the third categoric fault are easily solved by second grade math. That is, inflation, deflation, and maldisposition are solved respectively. Maldisposition is only solved by eradicating interest, And inflation and deflation are solved only by an obligatory schedule of payment which retires principal at the rate of consumption of the related property. Only that and that alone maintain a 1-to-1 relationship between circulation, remaining value of represented property, and